that raises a few different questions, right? So let me go back to the MAC analogy. And to me, the MAC analogy is you want to keep your MAC address safe because that prevents hackers from accessing it. So you want that to be as private as possible, is how I've always understood it. What I hear you saying, though, is that that uniqueness is what works with an NFT. However, it's going to be public by definition. So if it is public, isn't that a security risk? Like, why is it different in this case?
No, because, think of the NFT, again, it's a big, long number, right?
Yeah.
It's really a reference to something else. Just because you have the big, long number, it doesn't mean that you know what it references. You know what I'm saying? Right.
Yeah.
So, and in fact, that's a fundamental component of like how we built, kind of our technologies. For instance, RiceHash, we've talked about it before. It's a technology where we essentially create and manage NFTs and associate them to digital objects such as consent, like a patient consent, or for instance, a patient, like result of a patient kind of remote or rapid diagnostics tests, that you capture, from a test kit. That long non-fungible token number doesn't tell you what the actual information is, right? That's a reference to something that's stored somewhere else. It's an encrypted reference. However, what's very important, and this is the part that I think is really interesting, is that through that long, unique number, you can see the trail of transactions. Like, for instance, you could see that on August 31st, 2021, somebody with this long token number had a transaction, and let's say the transaction was, to record something onto a ledger. We don't know what that is. And then we know that for the same token, like an hour later, there was another transaction, and maybe that transaction was to somebody like you. Let's say you're a doctor. I know, we know you are, but or a pharmacist, actually, even more likely. Sure. You read that information, right? So I created it, but now you read it, and let's say another couple of hours later, a third person, let's say some kind of administrator, approves it. So the trail of the transactions is recorded to that one NFT, but by just looking at the ledger, you can't tell really who did what. Now, if you have the ledger, and access to the private information or the private key to decrypt it, now you could tell the full flow, right? But that's really where the privacy preservation comes in. So, and I think there's a misperception that just because something is on a public ledger, it's not privacy preserving, and that is wrong, right? Because, as they say, there's 1,001 ways to skin a cat. It's not that trivial that just because something is public, everything is public, right? We're able to differentiate between something that's a public auditable event or traceable thing that is useful, necessary, and really adds value. It adds traceability, it adds accountability, versus kind of like essentially divulging private information, patient information, financial information, or other kinds of information that should not be divulged in that way.
So you talk about this idea of just because it's public doesn't mean it's not private. Talk to me a little bit more about how it can be kept private. Is it the fact that it's a bunch of hashes or a bunch of numbers, and that's the fact that you can't connect it one-to-one is what makes it private? If so, first of all, is that accurate?
Not quite, right? So, I think the hashing really is referencing what this token ID looks like. You could also use encryption technology or also hashing technology to encrypt the actual data or encrypt the metadata about the actual data. All that is completely possible. And what you do, right? Again, I'm going to give you a real example. When we're working around this consent idea, right? We have a client, consent custody. We're working with them, their custodian and fiduciary around consent. So, the NFT, the actual token ID is public, right? The transaction ID, which is the transaction that goes on a ledger, that's public. Our signature, like Acoer signature or their signature, or cryptographic signature, that's public. And some metadata, for instance, metadata that says, okay, this transaction was a consent transaction, that's public. However, nothing else is public. Everything else essentially is encrypted and is stored, off the chain. And if you want to, if you're off the chain, if you're on the private database, obviously you have to have credentials, you log in, and there's security and normal things like this. But if an auditor comes, or if there's a need for discovery, and somebody says, "Hey, Jim, here's this NFT, and it basically references 5 transactions, all of which are encrypted because we can't really tell what the transaction is. Prove to us what they are." With the right, with the regulator in place, with the right permission, business permission, we're then able to traverse from the ledger to the private database and show, well, here's the actual transactions, right? Or as an example of using GDPR, if a patient said, "Hey, I want to exercise my right to be forgotten or to be deleted," right? And then prove to me that this happened. We can show that here's our transaction on our database that says Darshan's record has been removed or redacted or whatever it is. Here's a corresponding timestamp, like an immutable timestamp on a public ledger that shows a corresponding transaction. So they basically match. That's the idea.